Take a deep breath and let your body begin to soften. Let your eyes grow heavier with each blink. You've done enough today. There is nothing left for you to do but listen. Your feet are wet, your breath is white with chill, and your stomach has been growling since sunrise. You pass crooked timber homes with smoke curling from thatched roofs. Bread, for example, wasn't soft or sweet. It was almost never fresh. Medieval kitchens lacked refrigeration, so meat had to be preserved, usually by salting, drying, or soaking it in vinegar. These methods worked well enough, but they changed the taste. Imagine salted fish so pungent it had to be rehydrated in milk. In the countryside, fruit was picked fresh in season, so people drank weak ale, small beer, or diluted wine from dawn till dusk. Not to get drunk, though that happened too, but because it was safer. Children drank ale. Monks drank ale. Pregnant women drank ale. And if you were lucky, you could drink it warm from a clean mug. If not, it might taste a little sour, a little smoky, a little like something you shouldn't be drinking. Apples, pears, berries, plums. But without refrigeration, these had to be dried or boiled into jams to last. Milk was available, but usually turned quickly into cheese or butter if it didn't sour first. Eggs were precious. Chickens didn't lay regularly, and sweets? Unless you were royalty, sugar was a fantasy. Most people sweetened their food with honey, and even that was rare enough to be stored behind locked cabinets. Or beef so tough and dry it had to be stewed for 12 hours just to slice. And then there were spices if you could afford them. Nobles used copious amounts of spice, not to enhance flavor, but to cover spoilage. Not because the food was good, but because it was all they knew. They learned to make do, to flavor with herbs when they could, to cook slowly and stretch ingredients, to swallow without chewing if the texture turned your stomach. You are here, not in a castle or a feast hall, but in the gentle, earthy quiet of real history. The food was terrible, but the people endured. Meal times weren't joyful. They were functional. A moment of rest, a spoonful of hot mush, a cup of something fermented. That was enough. A stew might contain pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and a whiff of rot beneath it all. A single spoon passed from hand to hand. The silence of chewing, the deep, settling stillness of a stomach that is finally, if briefly, full. It was coarse, made from barley or rye, baked into heavy loaves that could be dry as brick. Some bread was so tough it had to be soaked in ale or broth just to chew. If you were especially poor, your bread might be mixed with ground beans, acorns, or even powdered bark. And if you couldn't afford a loaf, you might use a trencher, a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. After a meal, it soaked up grease and gravy and was either eaten, given to a beggar, or tossed to the dogs. Behind the doors, people are preparing their meals, but not the feasts of legend. Not great roast birds or platters of golden bread. What you're more likely to find is pottage thick, grayish mush of grain and whatever bits of vegetable or meat could be scavenged that day. Their tables were full, yes, but the food was often as bizarre as it was bad. Peacock, roasted and served in its own skin with feathers reattached. Swan, boiled until gray and served in almond milk. Eel pies, boiled boar heads. Jelly made from fish marrow. These were not meals, they were spectacles. Meant to dazzle, not nourish. Meant to display power, not satisfy hunger. It smells like cabbage, a little like onion. Mostly it smells like wet dirt. Castles were cold, and kitchens were often in a separate wing or building entirely. By the time a dish made its way from the fire to the Lord's table, it had cooled into a shiny, greasy paste. Forks were rare. Food was eaten with fingers or with a dull knife. Bones were tossed to the floor. Gravy ran across wooden boards. Table manners were inconsistent, and the smell of the smell was heavy with meat, wine, unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of spoiled dairy. And if you're lucky, it will be ready by sunset. The air around you is still and warm, like old linen left by a hearth. Leftover turnips, half-rotten leeks, dried peas with worms picked out, a small bone for flavor. Not meat, just the bone. It would simmer for hours, bubbling slowly while straw mats were laid on the floor, and children played with bits of wool. It wasn't about taste. It was about not starving. And so, every day, you'd eat it again. Outside your window, the sky is dark, the stars distant and quiet. Imagine a gentle fire crackling nearby, its light flickering against the stone walls of a medieval cottage. There's the faint smell of wood smoke, dry herbs hanging from the rafters, and something else less pleasant simmering in a large black pot over the coals. Let that scent settle softly in your mind. It's thick, earthy, slightly sour, because tonight our story begins with food, but not just any food. Tonight we drift back to a time when dinner wasn't a delight, it was survival. When what you ate could say everything about who you were and still leave you hungry. Our story tonight begins in the Middle Ages, where the food was very often awful. Let's set the scene. Imagine yourself walking down a muddy lane in a small English village around the year 1250. Pottage was the staple food for most medieval peasants. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, which is another way of saying it could hide a multitude of unpleasant ingredients. Now let yourself feel the texture, because medieval food wasn't just bland. It was strange. Meat, when it could be found, was another matter entirely. And speaking of nobles, let's not imagine they ate much better. And still, much of it was served lukewarm at best. You might be wondering, was it all this bad? Weren't there any good foods? Well, yes. Here and there. Drinks were no better. Water, though abundant, was often contaminated. Wells ran close to latrines. And still, through all this, people survived. Let yourself imagine that now. A small cottage, smoke curling through the rafters, children huddled near the hearth, the thick smell of cabbage and boiled barley curling in the air. Let your breathing match that stillness. Let your thoughts fall like breadcrumbs across a stone floor. Let the stillness return to you now, like steam rising from a bowl left too long on the hearth. Let your thoughts drift like a slow ladle through a pot of bubbling broth, thick, cloudy, and ancient. The firelight glows low. The village has gone quiet. Somewhere in the dark, an old pot simmers over coals, its contents soft and indistinct, but necessary. Millers were often distrusted, accused of skimming flour, or watering it down with chalk or powdered bone. Kitchens weren't stocked with pans or pots like today. The floor is straw and dirt. There's no spice rack, no recipe book. Fish was smoked and hung from hooks in the chimney. Meats were salted heavily and stored in barrels. Fruits were boiled into pastes or steeped in vinegar. Some people buried cabbages in the ground to keep them cold, using their fingers, maybe wiping their hands on straw or just their own tunics. The meals were simple, flat, colorless, but they were meals. Weddings featured the best a family could offer: meat, if it could be afforded, and bread baked fresh that morning. Not something sweet or crisp, but soft, lukewarm, and faintly sour. A spoonful of barley, a bite of dried pea, a chew of black bread soaked in broth. Nothing to savor, but enough to carry you through the day. But these were rare. Most days were the same. Boil what you have, eat what you're given. Thank the saints it didn't turn. Hunger, boil, swallow, sleep. Eggs were covered in lime water or packed in ash. Cheese was stored in cloth and turned regularly to keep it from molding too quickly. But despite all this, spoilage was constant. Mold grew fast. Bugs got in. Mice were common. People ate food that smelled off. They learned to live with it. They called it sharp or ripe. If it didn't make you ill, it was considered edible. Just a handful of roots in a basket and a few dried herbs hung from the rafters. The kind of meal that reminds you you're alive. If you're lucky, you might have garlic or sage. Let your body feel full of warm, dull food. Not delightful, but dependable. If you're not, you use nettles or wild mustard. There is no butter, no sugar, just lard, salt, and patience. A peasant family might have a single iron pot or kettle passed down for generations. It sat over the fire, blackened with soot, and cooked everything: pottage, ale, dairy. Bad meat brought fevers. Bread made with rotten grain led to convulsions. Not just meats and pies, but exotic animals, too. Roasted crane, heron, hedgehog. Dishes dyed bright colors using flowers or metals. Gold leaf was placed on pastries. Sugar sculptures decorated the tables. There were pies with live birds inside, yes. Actually, alive, meant to fly out when cut open, purely for show. But even these meals, so dramatic and strange, didn't always taste good. The spices masked age. The meat was stringy. The jellies trembled with fat. And the feasting halls, often cold, often smoky, often loud. There were no expiration dates, no labels. You ate by instinct, by smell, by trust. And sometimes your trust was misplaced. Sometimes even cloves were boiled in it to soften the fibers. This gave everything a shared flavor: a little onion, a little ash, a little wool. There was no oven in most homes. If you needed something baked, you brought it to the communal oven, usually once a week. You had to pay the oven keeper and wait your turn. And if you were late, your dough sat out too long. It fermented, it flattened. You baked it anyway. There were rumors that some added dust or sand to stretch a batch further. So even if you managed to bake bread, you might chip a tooth trying to eat it. There was no such thing as a soft baguette or fluffy roll. Just hard crusts and coarse, grayish interiors, dense and dry enough to last for days. Bread, if not eaten quickly, went stale. But nothing was wasted. It was dipped into ale. It was boiled into broth. It was fed to the pigs. Or to you. Welcome back to the Middle Ages, where dinner wasn't something to crave, but something to tolerate. As we settle in deeper, we must talk about flour, one of the most essential and most problematic ingredients of the medieval kitchen. Flour was rarely pure. It was often coarsely ground, and sometimes mixed with whatever was available. beans, peas, even ground-up tree bark. Not for flavor, but to stretch it. Wheat was expensive, so peasants mostly used rye or barley. And these grains came with a hidden danger: ergot, a fungus that grew on rye in damp seasons. Ergot caused twitching, hallucinations, and even death. Entire villages would unknowingly consume tainted bread and begin to shake, speak nonsense, or see visions. Even the mills were risky. Most grain was ground at communal mills, run by the local lord or monastery. Let's pause here for a moment. You're standing near the fire. The pottage bubbles. Let's talk about illness. Because when the food was bad, and it often was, it did more than offend your nose. It could kill. Spoiled dairy caused vomiting. And outside those halls the common folk huddled near fires, eating mush again, drinking weak ale, sharing one bowl. Yes, on feast days. Holidays like Easter or Christmas brought special dishes: honey cakes, roast goose, or spiced ale. Let your thoughts soften into that rhythm. Let your breath slow as you drift deeper into this ancient, grain-scented world. Let the quiet warmth of the firelight flicker behind your eyes, soft and orange and steady. You are not in your kitchen. You are not in your bed. You are somewhere else entirely, where time smells like barley and cabbage, and dinner is a quiet act of survival. The spoon is heavy in your hand. The bowl is warm. The taste is dull, and yet there is comfort in it. Cooking was done on open hearths, using iron hooks, tripods, and pots balanced carefully over glowing embers. Most people ate with fingers, scooping mush and sopping up broth with bread. Knives were personal, brought with you, kept sharp, used for everything. Forks were nearly unknown outside of Italy till much later. You stabbed with a dagger or used 2 fingers. You licked them clean or wiped them on your tunic or just let them dry. They did not improve the food so much as announce it. It was often cut poorly, left with bits of fur or splinters of bone. Just a piece of cheese too hard to bite. You scraped it with a knife, chewed slowly, drank something warm, and waited for sleep. A crust fallen to the floor was brushed off and eaten. Bones were boiled into broth. Apple cores were dried for tea. Every seed was saved. Every rind was repurposed. Even the ashes from the fire were used, mixed with lard and herbs, to create crude soap. Nothing was discarded. Everything had a second life. Hunger was common. Not starvation, but a constant background emptiness. Waking in the chill of a thatched room, dressing in wool, feeding the fire, the deep, steady silence of a world where food was never about joy. Only fuel, only function, only a fragile answer to a hungry day. And beginning the day by stirring a pot of yesterday's porridge, now thick, now sour, but warm. You share it with your family, silent and tired. No coffee, no toast, just spoonfuls of survival. That's all. And that was enough. Most people lived slightly underfed. Their bodies were lean, their bones strong, but their stomachs never quite full. Chickens were scrawny. Fish, if salted too long, were hard and tasted of brine. Pigs were not pampered. Children grew. Songs were sung. The food may have been terrible, but the people were still here, and so are you. They foraged in the streets, eating scraps and worse. So when you cooked their meat, you cooked it long. You boiled, you salted, you stewed, you hoped for the best. Cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, saffron, black pepper, they were luxury. Imported, costly. A single handful could buy a sheep. Dishes were spiced heavily, not because it tasted better, but because it tasted expensive, because it meant you had power. The flavor of authority was strange and strong meat swimming in almond milk and cinnamon, sauces with vinegar and ginger, birds stewed with raisins and cloves. The spices didn't always make sense, but they made a statement. There were no timers, no ovens with dials, just instinct and smell and time. You stirred until the texture changed. You listened for bubbles. These were slices of old bread, several days stale, hardened into slabs. You placed food on top. The juices soaked into the bread. If you were lucky, you ate the trencher afterward. If you weren't, it went to the dogs, or was tossed into a pile for beggars. The trenchers smelled like meat, sweat, and days-old grain. But they worked. You felt the heat on your knuckles. It was a slow dance, learned over generations, passed from hand to hand like a wooden spoon darkened with use. And that spoon? It might be the only one in the household. Most medieval meals were variations on a theme: boiled, salted, mashed, dried. Herbs were sometimes added: parsley, sage, thyme, especially in monasteries where gardens were better kept. But the average peasant had little access to these. They relied on onions, garlic, leeks, things that stored well and grew fast. When available, mustard seeds were ground into a paste and mixed with vinegar. It was sharp, right, something to hide the age of the meat. But even that was rare. Let us keep wandering gently through this strange old kitchen of history, where the worst food ever made was also the most necessary. You may wonder, what did people eat in the coldest months? In winter, when gardens froze and animals were slaughtered, food became even more difficult. Gruel made from oats, watered down and stirred with ash-stained spoons. Occasionally, a bit of milk or honey might sweeten it, but often it was just what was there: hot, plain, life-saving. You ate with your family around a single pot, each person dipping their spoon, each mouth quiet. There was no second helping, no dessert, just a long, slow chew, and the sound of a fire whispering in the background. This is when preservation mattered most. People ate salt pork, dried beans, smoked fish, and stale bread softened in hot broth. Anything fresh was rare, maybe a wrinkled apple, a bit of kale dug from under the snow, or a chunk of root vegetable that had survived in storage. Meals were smaller. Ale was thinner. Hunger lingered longer. And yet, people endured. Children grew up on this food. Their first tastes were often bland and bitter, and the fire mattered. Utensils were rare. Plates? Not quite. The wealthy had pewter or wood. The poor used trenchers. We mentioned them before. And what about flavor? That elusive thing we crave today? It barely existed. For the wealthy, spices were everything. And still, they didn't mask everything. The meat was often bad. Meat from the market might sit out for hours. Some days, meals weren't meals at all, just crusts, just ale. And yet, food was sacred. It was never wasted. So imagine now, as you lie there, how different a day might have felt. Let that rhythm rock you now, the scrape of the pot, the crunch of coarse bread, the low sound of boiling. And yet, people smiled. Rest now. You've chewed enough for one night. Let yourself settle again, deeper than before. Let your limbs melt into the mattress, your eyes drift further closed, and your breath follow the slow, gentle pace of a boiling pot on a quiet hearth. We're not rushing anywhere. Time itself is simmering. Outside, the air is cool and still, and inside you are warm, calm, and safely tucked into the slow, strange world of medieval kitchens. Their sweets, when they had them, were plain, dried fruit, maybe a bit of honey on bread. A string of dried onions hangs from the rafters. Garlic bulbs braided into a rope. A clay pot with salt, precious and gray. A crock with lard. Some oats. Maybe a bit of dried fish in a cloth bag, stiff as wood. This is the sum of your ingredients. Dinner is not about what you want. It is about what is left. Perhaps a small tart made from cheese, herbs, and whatever wild greens they could gather. Livers, hearts, kidneys, brains, feet, marrow. These were not scraps. They were essentials. Bone marrow was scooped and spread on bread like butter. A ladle dipped and passed. A crust torn and handed over. The sound of quiet chewing. No forks, no sugar. No napkins, just warmth, quiet, and a spoonful of something hot enough to keep the cold out a little longer. Blood was used in sausages and puddings. Fat was rendered into tallow for candles or used to fry oats. Let the rhythm of medieval hunger lull you to sleep, not from fear, but from the quiet understanding that even when the food was awful, the people endured. They found comfort and sameness in warmth, in whatever filled their belly for another day. A good housewife knew not just how to cook, but how to stretch every part of a meal until it fed 2, then 4, then 6. Flavor was never the goal. Sustenance was. Dessert, as we know, it didn't really exist. Sugar was rare and precious, kept, locked away like a jewel. The meals brought people together. Families huddled around the same pot. Neighbors traded herbs. Children learned to stir with the same spoon their great-grandparents once used. Food was bad, but it was shared, and that made it bearable. It was sold in cones called sugar loaves, which had to be broken apart with hammer and chisel. Most people went their entire lives without tasting it. Instead, sweetness came from boiled down fruits, or from spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, if you were lucky enough to live near a monastery that grew them. You've eaten your share of coarse bread and bitter pottage tonight. But there's more to explore, stranger things still hiding in the shadows of old stone pantries and crooked wooden shelves. You mash. If you were lucky enough to have one, it might be a chunk of black bread and ale. No butter, no eggs, no coffee. Just bread and drink. Workers in the fields might carry onions or cheese. Sometimes cold porridge from the day before, molded into a slab, sliced with a knife, and eaten with fingers. Meals blurred together. The names mattered less than the function. Hunger didn't follow a clock. It followed the seasons. It followed your work. It followed whether your harvest had failed, or the flour had gone moldy, or the cow had stopped giving milk. You fry in fat. Instead, it was churned into butter or curdled into cheese. Curdling was not considered a flaw, it was a technique. Milk was left to sour, then mixed with rennet from a calf's stomach to separate the curds and whey. The curds became cheese. The whey was fed to pigs. Nothing wasted. Everything used. You chew slowly. You thank the saints. As the Middle Ages progressed, food continued to reflect a very clear hierarchy, not just of wealth, but of morality. What you ate said something about who you were. In the eyes of the church, gluttony was a sin, and fasting was a virtue. So food wasn't only about hunger, it was about control. Monks and nuns followed strict diets. Many avoided meat entirely. They ate fish, legumes, bread, and simple vegetables often boiled beyond recognition. And yet, even here, the rules got bent. Some monasteries reclassified animals to fit within religious loopholes. Beavers, for instance, were considered fish because they lived in water and so could be eaten during Lent. Otters, too. Even barnacle geese were rumored to grow on trees near the sea and were thus declared acceptable as seafood. It wasn't about logic. It was about belief and survival. And then there were the feast days. When the fasting ended, food became elaborate again. Roasted birds, spiced pastries, and custards made from almond, milk, and honey. These meals were rare but grand, and yet still strange to modern eyes. One common dish was called hedgehog, not made from the animal, but from minced pork, shaped into a round form, spiked with almond slivers to resemble quills. It was meant to delight the eye, not the mouth. Presentation mattered more than taste. You could find birds stuffed inside other birds, or meat dyed blue or gold. Peacocks were skinned, roasted, and then redressed in their own feathers before being served majestic, but tough and nearly inedible. The result was always beautiful, but not always enjoyable. For the poor, such displays were fantasy. Let us pause here and imagine the kitchen of a modest village home. There is no pantry full of jars, just baskets, pots, and hooks. So you boil. And what of breakfast? Speaking of milk, it was risky. Without pasteurization or refrigeration, it turned quickly. It was rarely drunk fresh. Even the parts of animals we discard today were prized. And yet, in all of this bad bread, sour milk, strange meats, there was a strange beauty. Let that image settle in your mind now. The flickering light of a single fire. A pot swaying gently from a chain. Let your thoughts grow slow now, like honey cooling in a dish. You're almost asleep now. Just one more taste of history before you rest. Let the stillness stretch wider now, like dough rising slowly on a warm stone floor. Let your thoughts drift, soft and steady, as the steam of the past curls quietly around your memory. There is no rush here, no urgency, only the slow simmer of a story thick with grain and smoke and time. You are still wrapped in the world of medieval kitchens, dark, smoky, and endlessly resourceful. The leftovers were sometimes scraped off and given to servants, or recooked the next day into stew. A child's crust of bread might be saved for later. You're in a stone cottage, the fire low, the pot bubbling gently. They craved warmth. They craved fullness. They craved a day without pain, and a night without hunger. And if the bread was hard and the meat smelled faintly off, they blessed it all the same. Every bite a small success. In years of crop failure, people ate bark, shoe leather, or even dug up old graves in desperation. The Great Famine of 1315 left many villages in silence. Entire fields were bare. Livestock died. You are safe in your bed, full of soft pillows and silence. But somewhere centuries ago, someone your age was chewing black bread in silence, staring into a fire, grateful for whatever boiled thing sat steaming in a bowl. There is nothing more to cook tonight. Just rest, just warmth, just the knowledge that even in a time of spoiled milk and wormy beans, people sat together and found enough to live through tomorrow. Rain came when it shouldn't. Grain spoiled in wet storage. Bread became scarce. Even nobles began to ration. The air smells like boiled turnip. and sour ale. A single candle flickers on the table. The bowl in front of you is chipped. The spoon is wooden. The broth inside is thin, but it's warm, and in that moment, it's enough. Children were put to bed early to forget their hunger. Monks fasted not as virtue, but necessity. Women stirred empty pots, letting steam fill the room like a lullaby. And when spring came again, they planted everything. Every inch of ground became a chance to eat again. Beans, onions, barley, herbs. They planted in window boxes, in courtyards, between stones. And still no tomatoes, no potatoes, no corn. Those would not arrive in Europe for centuries. Bits of fat were saved to fry future meals. Even bones were broken open to suck out the marrow, then dried and used as handles or combs. A mother might make broth from onion skins, roots, and chicken feet. The poorest learned to chew boiled nettles, to stew weeds, to mash dried peas into something resembling dinner. Sometimes food was sculpted to impress an entire table made of sugar, or a meatloaf shaped like a castle. The nobles didn't need it to taste good. They needed it to look like power. And the deeper we wander, the more we discover that survival was not just about food. It was about what food meant. Let's drift further. We haven't yet spoken about feasting, not in the way it truly existed. In great halls lit by torches and echoing with boots on stone, the nobility dined with full display. But the food, though grand in theory, was often worse than what a peasant would eat. Lavish banquets featured multiple courses, but these were not like modern meals. One course might include 10 different dishes: roasted birds, jellied meats, boiled vegetables dyed pink with beetroot, custards hardened with bone marrow, and spiced wine served lukewarm. It wasn't about flavor. It was about abundance. Meat piled on meat. A pie might be filled with pigeons or frogs or eels, baked whole and seasoned heavily to mask the flavor. These meals were noisy, with dogs at the nobles' feet and musicians playing above the din. Food was brought out on great trays. People grabbed what they wanted. Bones were tossed aside. There were no napkins, just tablecloths where hands were wiped, or sleeves. People did not drink water. They drank spiced wine, often mulled with sugar and clove, or ale thick with yeast and sediment. There was little distinction between sweetness and salt. Everything blurred into a texture, lumpy, fatty, soupy, or chewy. Feasts could last for hours. Guests were expected to eat only a portion, often the best-looking bite, and leave the rest as a display of wealth. Now, contrast that with a rural village where the meal was sacred and food waste was unthinkable. Let's return to that imagery now, because medieval people didn't crave delicious. And then, of course, there were the plagues. Famine, disease, bad harvests. These shaped the entire food culture. In times like these, food became memory. People told stories about the meals they once had. Let your breath slow now, in time with this rhythm of hunger and hope. You are not cold. You are not empty. And that's the quiet magic of bad food. It doesn't need to be good. It only needs to arrive. Now you're nearly asleep. The stew has cooled. The candle's flame has dipped low. And now, you will too. You're drifting now. The firelight flickers lower. Your breath grows slower. And the smell of boiled grain and musty herbs floats quietly through your thoughts. Let the noise of the modern world fall away. There are no restaurants here. No sizzling pans. No golden oil. They were precious, unpredictable, and nearly impossible to store. Instead, it was churned into butter pale, salty, and often speckled with herbs or transformed into cheese, which was safer, longer lasting, and just as essential as bread. In a world ruled by religious fasting days, meat was forbidden dozens of days each year. You might find dried anchovies, but only a few. You might boil them with onions to make broth, or mash them into a kind of paste to spread on bread. The taste was strong, salty, fermented, and always eaten in silence. Meals were not chatter-filled occasions. They were often quiet. People ate with focus. Nettles, which stung your fingers but soft-end in stew. Wild garlic, pungent and precious. Berries, mushrooms, hazelnuts, dandelions. Each one came with risk and reward. Some mushrooms were edible, others killed slowly. You learned to recognize by smell, by feel, by watching animals. You've eaten your fill of oat mush and salted fish. You've tasted sharp cheese and gray broth, and still you're here. Let the crumbs fall from your hands. Let the last spoon rest in the bowl. There's no need to chew anymore. Just breathe. You've survived the worst food in history, if only in your imagination. The taste might have faded, but the feeling remains. That warmth, that silence, that strange sense of comfort, even when comfort was barely present. You learned what plants could be steeped for tea, what flowers could be dried for stomach cramps, what weeds could be eaten raw. There were no grocery stores. The forest was your market. The edge of the field was your medicine shelf. With need, with caution. Fish, however, was allowed, and so it became the backup. Dried, smoked, salted beyond recognition. Mist curls through the trees. Your hands are cold. You've risen with the sun. In the corner, a pot of oats bubbles over the fire. There's no flavor, just water and grain. You stir slowly, your breath clouding. The children wake and sit in silence. You ladle it into rough wooden bowls. There's no sugar. Maybe a few slivers of apple, dried and rehydrated. Maybe a shred of hard cheese. The spoon lifts. The mouth opens. The food is hot, thick, bland, but it fills you. Cod, herring, eel, lamprey. Some were caught fresh. Most were bought preserved. Salt fish was soaked overnight, then boiled. Not joyfully, but dependably. In autumn, you harvested roots and stored onions. Honey cakes made with coarse flour and crushed nuts. Fruit stews boiled into mush. Puddings made with blood and dried fruits. Custards made with almond milk, thickened by eggs or starch. They were heavy, thick, barely sweet by today's standards. But they were rare. Most people ended meals with nothing. Just a final bite of bread. Just the last sip of ale. Just the fire burning lower. In winter, you lived on salt and smoke. In spring, you foraged. Every season had its flavor. And none were sweet. It flaked apart like wood pulp and smelled as strong as the sea itself. Eels were stewed or baked into pies. Lampreys, long, jawless, and eel-like, were cooked into gelatinous pastes, served with vinegar and spice. These dishes were not delightful. They were endured. A successful meal meant no illness, no gagging, just calories. Cheese was sour, gritty, and sometimes sharp with age. It wasn't wrapped in wax or paper. It was stored in cloth or left hanging in cool corners of the home. The flavor changed depending on the cow, the grass, the weather, or how many days the milk had sat. before the curdling began. It was not always pleasant, but it was dense, filling, durable. Chickens in medieval villages were not the plump, eager layers we imagine today. They laid few eggs, and only seasonally. In colder months there were no eggs at all. In spring you might find a few in the straw or hidden beneath a roosting hen. These were boiled or added to thick porridge, or beaten into custards if milk was plentiful. There were no refrigerators, so eggs were sometimes packed in ash or lime water to extend their life. But even then they spoiled quickly, turning greenish and sharp. And yet, when you cracked a good one firm, bright, warm from the nest, it was a kind of miracle. Only smoke, sour dough, and something brown bubbling endlessly in a pot. You're resting in a world that moved to the slow, sticky rhythm of spoons scraping wood, and hunger held in silence. And even though the food was terrible, this world still fed its people, one careful meal at a time. Tonight we travel deeper into the flavors, if they can be called that of a medieval table. And we must begin with the eggs. Milk, as we've said before, followed a similar path. It curdled fast. It was rarely drunk fresh, and the fish so much fish. And in places far from the coast, even fish became a luxury. Let us pause here and walk through a morning meal in a modest household. It is gray outside. Then you rise. You begin your work. The food holds you through it. And then, of course, there were foraged foods, the wild blessings of the landscape. Seasons dictated everything. In summer you might eat greens and berries. Even the desserts, when they did appear, were strange. Let your thoughts drift now like steam through a broken window pane. You're nearly asleep now. The pot has been emptied. The fire has gone dim. And in the stillness of the medieval night, your belly is finally full. Sink a little deeper now. The past is thick and quiet, like stew left to cool in a clay bowl. You're floating in a place where food wasn't delicious. It was necessary. One might think the food here was better, fancier, but what it gained in show, it often lacked in actual taste. Food was prepared in massive cauldrons. Spices were measured out like gold, dust, saffron, cinnamon, black pepper, galangal, used not to enhance flavor but to flaunt wealth. Meals were seasoned so heavily that even the primary ingredient disappeared beneath the layers. A village bakehouse, perhaps, where people came to bake their loaves in communal ovens. Not every home had its own oven. The fuel was expensive, and the smoke thick. If it went stale, it became a trencher. If it molded, it was fed to pigs. If it dried completely, it was crumbled into soup. Bread was not just a food, it was a timeline. It marked how many days had passed since baking, how many meals remained before the next flour sack had to be opened. The strange peace of knowing that even in a time when food was gray and gritty and nearly flavorless, there was still comfort in sharing it, in making it, in stirring the pot with hands that knew exactly how to stretch a single onion into 3 days of meals. So instead, villagers brought their shaped dough to the bakehouse, marked with their family's unique symbol scratched onto the dough's surface with a twig or cut with a knife. Let your limbs grow heavy and warm, like a bowl cooling in your lap. There the baker would manage the fire, slide the loaves in with a long-handled paddle, and watch them carefully so they wouldn't burn. A meat pie might contain minced rabbit, hard-boiled eggs, currants, and vinegar, all wrapped in a crust so tough it was often inedible. It was made with whatever grain was on hand: rye, barley, sometimes a bit of wheat if the harvest had been kind. The texture was rough, the crust was thick. Sometimes bits of stone from the grinding process got into the flour. These could wear down your teeth over time, giving even young adults the molars of the elderly. Bread was not soft and fluffy. It was survival pressed into a slab. The crust wasn't for eating. It was for holding the filling during baking, like an edible Tupperware. Noble meals were extravagant in size, but strange in substance. A heel of bread torn into chunks. A pewter cup of small beer, barely alcoholic, brewed weak to purify the water. The room is dim. No forks, no sauce, no citrus, no spice unless you were rich or lucky. Just soft chewing, hot broth, and silence. And yet, it worked. It kept people alive through winters and wars, through droughts and plagues, through famine and fear. The food was terrible, but it was dependable. Outside, the wind moves softly through the fields. You sit close to the fire, the bowl warming your hands. The taste is nothing, but the warmth is everything. Boiled hooves and bones yielded gelatin, which was cooled and used to encase cooked meats. Sometimes they were dyed with beetroot or saffron to give them bright hues. A tower of jellied fish, wobbling on the table, was considered the height of elegance. Guests poked at it cautiously, perhaps nibbling a piece, but rarely finishing the whole thing. Like so much in noble life, the food was for show. The taste didn't matter. Swan, for instance, was roasted and served with its feathers reattached for decoration. The meat was dark, oily, and tough, but it looked regal. Porpoise, yes, the sea creature, was sometimes boiled for fast days, considered fish by ecclesiastical logic, and the taste? Sour and rubbery. It was consumed not for pleasure, but because it demonstrated access and rarity. A place where meals weren't celebrations, but survival strategies. You've already tasted the salted fish, the black bread, the broth of bones and roots. And still there is more, so close your eyes. Let your breath stretch long. You are safe. You are full. And you are ready to drift back into the kitchens of a world that fed itself with the blandest hopes and the most stubborn hands. Let's step into a castle now, not the peasant hut, not the monastery, but the grand echoing stone halls of nobility. In the kitchens behind the scenes, dozens of cooks labored under thick smoke and grease. And then there were jellies, not the fruit kind, but meat jellies. But let's leave the castle behind now. Let's slip back into something humbler. The bread came out hard, dark, and dense. Children chewed it slowly. Elders dipped it in broth. Travelers carried it tied to their belts. It was never wasted. Now imagine a quiet supper, a table of worn wood, a bowl of pottage barley, leeks, maybe a bit of bacon, if fortune smiled. That's what it was like, over and over, year after year. Let that truth settle into your breath now. The simplicity, the rhythm. Soften now. Let your thoughts fall like barley into boiling water. Let your mind become a slow simmer. You are full. You are warm. And the fire has not gone out. Let yourself sink even deeper now into that soft, slow rhythm of a world lit only by candlelight and fed by patience. Your breath drifts like steam curling from a pot left too long on the hearth. Every sound is muffled by thick stone walls and straw-stuffed eaves. You are surrounded by the quiet rituals of nourishment, none of them delicious, all of them necessary. The meals are plain, but the peace is deep. There is no rush here, just slow cooking, quiet chewing, and the constant hope that tomorrow's pot will have something more in it than today's. Tonight we remember one of the most peculiar truths of medieval kitchens. Not all food was meant to taste good, some was meant to signal your status, your humility, or your piety, and some wasn't even meant to be eaten at all. This brings us to the world of subtleties, elaborate, edible sculptures made from sugar, almond paste, or even dyed dough. These were shaped into castles, animals, saints, or entire scenes from mythology, and placed at the center of grand feasts. Sometimes they were made with actual gold, leaf, or gems pressed into the sides. These were for looking, not chewing, and if someone did eat them, they'd likely taste dry, chalky, or bitter from whatever herbs had been added to keep pests away. Meanwhile, in monasteries, food was part of a spiritual schedule. Meals were eaten in silence. Conversation was replaced by scripture readings. The monks sat at long wooden tables, hands folded, waiting for a signal to begin. Their meals were small and humble. Bean stew, black bread, boiled vegetables, a piece of dried fish if it was a feast day. But even in these sacred places, rules were bent. Some monasteries grew fat on donated goods, sacks of sugar, wheels of cheese, barrels of salted meat, and their cooks became expert at bending the rules of fasting. If a recipe avoided red meat but included 12 types of fish, eggs, and sweetened almond milk, technically it was still pious. There's something oddly comforting in that, and how inventive people became when the rules felt too rigid. A sense that even centuries ago, people found little ways to soften life's edges, to make bad food bearable, to sneak sweetness into a bitter world. And still, the average villager didn't have such luxuries. For them, variety was rare, meals repeated day after day. One of the most common dishes across centuries was simply called pottage, a thick stew made from whatever was available: onions, cabbage, barley, herbs, beans, and maybe a scrap of meat. It cooked all day over the fire, constantly added to, never fully emptied. Some pots weren't washed for weeks, just topped up and stirred. The flavors blended, changed, faded. One bowl might taste like turnip, the next like leeks and fat, but it was always hot, always thick, always there, and with it, ale. Weak ale brewed in homes, because water was often unsafe to drink. It was cloudy, barely fizzy, and left a yeasty smell in the air. Even children drank it. In wealthier homes, wine might be served, but it was often sour and had to be spiced or watered down to be palatable. Spices like cloves, cinnamon, and ginger weren't for flavor, they were for masking rot. Meat that had started to turn could be covered in heavy spice to fool the nose and dull the taste. There were no expiration dates. Your nose was your guide, and your stomach, your test. It's strange, isn't it? How much danger was always lurking in something as simple as a meal. Mold on the bread, worms in the flour, tainted fish, spoiled milk, meat gone green. And yet, people ate it. They had to. Hunger was stronger than fear, and the body remarkably adapted. Now, close your eyes if they're not already closed. Imagine the flicker of firelight on a worn wooden bowl. Hear the soft scraping of a spoon, the slow, careful chewing. There is no rush. You are seated on a stool worn smooth by generations. The pot on the fire is old, the broth is thin, but you are safe. You are warm. You are fed. You're starting to drift, aren't you? The taste of the past has filled your mind. The quiet desperation. The brilliant inventiveness. The slow, rhythmic way that hunger carved its place into daily life, and still people endured. So let the warmth of that endurance carry you now. Let it settle into your chest like a bowl of warm grain. Let it quiet your thoughts. Let the flickering memory of hard bread and soft silence lull you toward sleep. You've traveled far tonight, through smoke and broth, through jellied meats and stale loaves, through bitter herbs and feasts built for the eyes, not the tongue. And all of it has brought you to this moment, this stillness. Let it hold you. Let it rest with you. There is nothing more to eat tonight. Only sleep. Sink deeper into the quiet now. The night has grown heavy, like a pot thick with barley left to bubble over low coals. The story is still simmering, but you are softer now, quieter, as if your body understands the rhythm of this slow, strange world. A world where food was simple, bland, sometimes dreadful, but always deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. Let the warmth of the hearth settle in your chest. Let your limbs loosen, as if you too have spent the day kneading coarse dough or foraging along the edge of a frost-bitten field. You're doing nothing now. You're simply here, listening, resting. As the centuries passed, the food didn't get much better, but it did become more ritualized. Holidays brought small changes to the table. Special loaves, pastries shaped like animals, pies with hidden trinkets inside. On feast days, the rules bent a little more butter, more eggs, maybe a sprinkle of sugar, if you were lucky. A 12th night cake, made with whatever sweets could be spared, might be shared among a whole village. The person who found the bean hidden inside would be crowned king or queen for the night, a silly tradition, but one that broke the rhythm of bland porridge and brought laughter to the table. Even in the most modest homes, people found ways to make do. Leftover grains might be fried into small cakes. Bones roasted a second time to coax out the last of their flavor. Apple peels dried and steeped for tea. Bread crusts soaked in ale to become a kind of pudding. Nothing was wasted. Every crumb had a use. Every drop of fat was saved. Even ashes from the fire could be used to scrub pots clean. And oh, the utensils, or lack thereof. Forks were rare. Most people ate with a spoon in their fingers. Knives were shared. Bowls were communal. People sat on benches and dipped from the same pot. Hands were wiped on bread or sleeves or nothing at all. There were no napkins, no separate courses, no polished silver. Food was not art, it was effort. And once eaten, the tools were simply rinsed in water and left to dry near the fire. Hygiene was rudimentary. Germ theory didn't exist. Illness came and went, often without explanation. But still, people gathered for meals, side by side, trusting their bodies to endure what the food might bring. And endure they did, not because the food was nourishing, not because it was clean, but because people are stubborn, ingenious, resourceful in ways we often forget. A boiled onion in weak broth could mean survival. A stale loaf soaked in milk could mean another day of labor. A bruised apple might be sliced thin and shared by 6 children. And somehow, it was enough. Let's step outside now, just for a moment. The kitchen is behind us. The fields stretch wide, quiet under the stars. You can almost hear the low rustle of wind through dry grain. A few late coals glow red behind you. You're holding a cloth bundle your lunch for tomorrow. A wedge of cheese, a scrap of meat, maybe an egg if you were lucky today. You tie it gently. Place it near the door. You'll rise before the sun and walk with others to work the land. And when the midday bell rings, you'll sit in the dirt and eat slowly, watching your breath cloud the air. The food will be dry, salty, bland, but you will chew it with gratitude. Because in the Middle Ages, meals weren't measured by their taste, but by their ability to sustain. The best meal was the one that kept you upright, that quieted your stomach long enough to finish your work, that didn't make you sick, that kept your children alive another week. And in that way, even the worst food became something sacred. Let that sink in now, the holiness of survival, the quiet grace of a bad meal eaten together, the blessing of a bowl of gray porridge shared in silence beside the fire. You're getting heavier now. Sleep is folding in around you, like dough turned gently in flour. You're safe, you're warm, you've eaten, and though the flavors have faded, the story remains. The worst food in history still held people together, and now it has held you too. Drift with me now into the final corners of this world. Your mind is soft as old bread. Your body is heavy with imagined broth and firelight. The taste of medieval food, so grim, so gray, has faded into a quiet hum in the background of your thoughts. You are full of stories now. Stories of trenchers soaked in stew, of smoked fish eaten in silence, of slow, stubborn cooking that never asked to be liked, only to last. We are almost done, but there are still a few more crumbs to gather before we fold this evening up and let sleep take over completely. Let's pause for a moment on the idea of meals as medicine, because for many, food wasn't just fuel. It was a kind of healing, at least. People hoped it was. In the absence of modern science, beliefs about humors and balance shaped what was eaten and when. Hot foods were said to balance cold bodies, dry foods to fix wet temperaments. If someone was pale and sluggish, they might be fed mustard and pepper to ignite the bile. If they were feverish, they might be given boiled pears or milk cooled in a cellar. Every food had a temperature, not in degrees, but in nature. Garlic was hot, lettuce was cold. Wine was warm. Watercress was bitter and thought to stimulate the blood. These ideas came from ancient Greek medicine, but they lasted for centuries. And so food was chosen with care, even when taste wasn't the goal. A woman in confinement after childbirth might be fed only soft, moist foods like stewed barley, or poached eggs, so her body could recover and balance. A man recovering from fever might receive a chicken boiled for hours with herbs and strained through cloth. The fat skimmed carefully from the top. The broth would be cloudy, bland, and a bit greasy, but it was believed to restore vitality. There were no pills, no prescriptions, only food and prayers. And time. It wasn't all sorrow, though. There were moments of lightness, especially during celebrations. Weddings brought out whatever sweets could be scrounged, wafers made over, fire, pastries filled with dried fruits, even marzipan, if someone knew how to work with almonds. During fairs or religious festivals, street vendors sold meat pies, fried fritters, or honey-covered nuts. The food might still be hard, dry, or odd-smelling, but for a moment it was exciting, different, special, and children, they learned early to eat what was given. There were no picky eaters in the medieval village. Hunger overruled preference. But still, there was joy in gathering berries, in licking honey from fingers and sneaking bits of roasted turnip from the pot. Children laughed at how sticky their hands became from overcooked stews. They sat cross-legged in the dirt with crusts in hand, watching chickens peck or dogs beg. Food was part of growing, not just physically, but socially. You learned how to chew slowly, how to share, how to say thank you, even when the food tasted like old socks. And you learned to listen during meals, because the adults around the fire would murmur about the weather, the harvest, the cost of salt. You'd hear about someone who got sick from bad berries, or someone who saved a whole family by trading smoked fish for winter apples. You'd learn what food meant, not just the chewing, but the weight of it, the pressure to store enough, to dry enough, to ration without resentment. Food was always on their minds, and now it's gently in yours. Imagine now that final quiet of the evening. The pot is scraped clean, the bowls are rinsed, the bread crusts are tucked into a cloth for tomorrow. You're lying near the hearth, wrapped in wool. Your stomach is full not, joyfully but adequately, and that's enough. Outside the world is dark. Stars press against the edges of the thatch. Somewhere a dog shifts, a baby murmurs in sleep, and the last ember pops softly. The worst food in history has done its work. It has fed you, not your body, perhaps, but your imagination, your sense of history, your quiet appreciation for soft bread, for clean water, for spice and sugar and choice. You awake with all that's still in you, but for now you can sleep in the arms of barley and leeks, of cheese and broth, of stories stirred over coals and passed down by candlelight. There. There's no dessert tonight, only stillness, only dreams, only rest. You are floating now, far from the table. The fire has gone quiet behind you. The plates, wooden and dented, are stacked away, and the world has gone still, save for the soft creak of the rafters and the hum of night insects outside. You are safe here, not full in the way we know it today, but fed with understanding, with quiet gratitude. Let your breath become slower, deeper. Let the images drift gently past bread ovens and barley stews, turnip fields, and communal bakehouses. The story continues, even as your body rests. Let's take a gentle detour into a place rarely discussed, the food of the imprisoned, the punished, and the forgotten. In medieval jails, food was minimal and often provided by the family of the accused. If no one brought you bread or gruel, you simply didn't eat. Some cells had small holes in the wall for passing food through flat cakes of flour and water, sometimes a cup of ale if the jailer was kind. Many prisoners grew sick not from injury, but from starvation or rotten fare, moldy bread, maggot-riddled meat, water that carried more disease than it cured in hospitals. The story was only a little better. Patients were given food thought to be healing: warm milk, stewed prunes, soft porridge. But cleanliness was scarce. Flies swarmed the bowls. Linens weren't changed. Spoons were wiped between patients, not washed. Illness lingered in the broth. Still, caregivers believed food held power. They whispered prayers over meals, marked loaves with crosses, rubbed garlic over bowls to chase away bad air. Hope, like the stew, was thin, but it was there. Now let's walk again, quiet footsteps over hard-packed dirt to a rural abbey garden where monks and nuns grew their own herbs. Imagine the rose, parsley, sage, borage, mint, thyme. These were used in stews, but also as medicine, steeped into teas or sprinkled over hot stones for the sick to inhale. In a time before modern medicine, food and healing were inseparable. A soup made with leeks and garlic might be prescribed for lung ailments. Warm honey and vinegar water for sore throats. Boiled nettles for the blood. Taste mattered less than purpose, and purpose was always survival. Let your thoughts slow again, like a pot being stirred one last time before the fire is doused. We've touched kitchens and feast halls, monasteries and market stalls. But what about the road? What did travelers eat? A pilgrim might carry hard cheese, dried fruit, stale bread, and a flask of thin ale or watered wine. Inns were rare and expensive. Most travelers relied on generosity or theft. There were no gas stations, no rest stops, just hedgerows and open paths. Sometimes travelers foraged, mushrooms, nuts, watercress growing by rivers. But for the most part, they rationed carefully, chewed slowly, and endured. Imagine sitting under a tree, the road behind you, a cold wind rising and unwrapping your day's meal, a crust of bread gone hard as stone, a bit of salted meat wrapped in cloth, maybe a dried apple. You eat quietly, with fingers stiff from cold, and then you move on. Even kings did not travel in comfort. Their food followed in carts, carried by servants and cooked over makeshift fires. Roasted meats, spiced pies, preserved fruits. But everything grew cold before it could be served. Dishes were brought out tepid, steam rising only briefly before vanishing into the night air. And yet they called it luxury. You see now, don't you? Why medieval food, so praised in fairy tales, so romanticized in films, was in truth often dreadful. But it did not stop life. It held life together. With bone broth and thick crusts, with oily fish and sour ale, with gray gruel and roasted roots, people survived. And now you, tucked in and soft, wrapped in warmth, have taken that journey too. Not with your feet, but with your breath. Your breath that now rises and falls like a spoon circling a pot. Your breath that carries you gently from one century to the next dot. Let go now. Let the stories do the eating. You have nothing more to chew, just dreams to swallow. You are resting now in the last light of a candle, in the final scrape of a wooden spoon against a nearly empty bowl. The story has settled into your bones like warmth after a long day. Let it deepen. Let it soften you. The worst food in history. And still, somehow it filled people with enough strength to wake up again the next day. And now you're safe in your bed, with clean sheets and warm air, are resting inside their memories, floating gently through their kitchens, their fields, their cold stone dining halls. You are not alone here. You are surrounded by centuries of quiet hunger and gentle survival. Let's pause now in one of the strangest places for medieval food, the Court of Fools. In royal courts across Europe, jesters were often the only ones allowed to speak freely, and sometimes they were fed accordingly. Their meals might be richer than a peasant's, but served at odd hours or in strange combinations. Cheese floating in ale, sausages wrapped in leaves, porridge dyed blue for amusement, a joke to others, but for the jester it was still sustenance. Some wrote about these meals in riddles. Others learned to savor them slowly, knowing that what came to the jester's table today might not come again tomorrow. Elsewhere in the castle, the servants ate behind the scenes. After the noble family had taken their fill, the leftovers were gathered bones with meat still clinging to them, crusts of bread dipped in gravy, spoiled fruit with soft spots cut away. These scraps were mixed together, rewarmed, and served. To those who had carried the plates, stoked the fires, and washed the blood from the roasting spits, they ate quickly, quietly, before the next bell called them back to duty. Some meals were surprisingly good. Others caused aching bellies for days, but it was still food, still warmth, still a reason to sit down. And then, far from the castle walls, we find the beggars, the ones with no bowls of their own. They waited near church doors, along muddy roadsides, outside market stalls. Sometimes a kind hand offered them broth, sometimes just a heel of bread, often nothing at all. And yet even they created routines, sleeping near bakehouses for the warmth, drinking from rain barrels when they could. A beggar who knew the rhythm of a town could survive longer than a stranger with coin, because knowing where food might appear was more valuable than gold. Even more fascinating, in certain places some animals were better fed than people. Horses belonging to knights were given oats and clean water, while villagers boiled grass for soup. Monks fed chickens corn, while orphans chewed leather. Dogs of noblemen ate bones with marrow, while travelers gnawed bark. And still people endured. Still they sang while they worked. Still they knelt to say grace before each thin, gray meal. You see, medieval food wasn't only about taste or texture. It was about position. What you ate told the world who you were. Nobles ate white bread. Peasants ate rye. Nobles drank wine. Peasants drank ale. Nobles had spices. Peasants had onions. Food marked your place on the ladder, and the rungs rarely shifted. Unless you married up or snuck into a monastery or fought your way into knighthood, your plate would stay the same for life. But even among the noble class, meals were not what we imagine. A feast might last hours with hundreds of dishes, but most were meant for display. Elaborate pies that sang when opened, filled with birds. Whole peacocks roasted and redressed in their own feathers. Bread dyed red and gold. A jelly molded in the shape of a castle. Guests took a bite or two, then pushed it away, and the rest, often wasted, or fed to dogs, or tossed to the servants in the lowest kitchens. Rich food, but still tasteless, overcooked, overspiced, heavy. It was power. On a plate, not pleasure. And so we return to the idea that medieval food, the worst food in history, was never really about joy. It was about making it through. One more day, one more season, one more generation. And when the bad bread ran out and the salted fish was gone, people still found ways to survive. Soup from weeds, broth from bones, bread from chestnuts and ash, and hope. Now you, tucked in so gently, can honor that survival with rest. The hunger is not yours, the hardship is not yours, but the story has passed through you like a meal shared between friends. You've tasted the worst food in history, and still you've been nourished. You've almost reached the end. Just a few more bites, just a little more sleep. Breathe in again, as if your chest were a hearth rekindling itself. But gently, slowly. The smoke has cleared, the soup has cooled, and the kitchen is dark but peaceful. You're lying in a space long forgotten by time, where the only things that matter are warmth, quiet, and the memory of food that once filled countless bellies poorly, yes, but persistently. You're not hungry here. You're not uncomfortable. You're only watching from somewhere above and beside, like the quiet soul of the past itself. Float a little closer, just for a few more moments. There are still a few things left to taste not. With your mouth, but with your imagination, let us drift now into the markets, loud and bustling in the daylight, but eerily silent at night. Picture the wooden stalls covered in fraying linen, the last glimmer of tallow candlelight catching on copper pots and wilted turnips. During the day, these stalls overflowed with whatever was available: cabbages with holes from slugs, piles of limp herbs, baskets of wrinkled apples, smoked eels coiled like ropes. Fishmongers shouted through the mud, their wares glistening with scales and melting ice. Bakers stacked loaves in towers, their crusts dark and cracked, marked by thumbprints and soot. Nothing looked clean by today's standards, but everything had its place. Even the spoiled food sold at a discount, fed to animals, or quietly thrown to the pigs behind the butcher's tent. Now imagine walking through this market at twilight. The crowds are gone. The smells linger: yeast, salt, sour cabbage, old blood. A dog trots past, licking something in the dust. You carry a cloth bag, your fingers stiff from cold. You buy a small onion, a wedge of yellowed cheese, and 2 eggs that you shake gently to make sure they're whole. You smile at the vendor, who doesn't smile back, and then you walk home with your dinner tucked into your coat like treasure. That is what food was in so many places: a treasure, not a joy, not a craft, not an experience, but a guarded, rationed, precious thing, something to stretch, something to save, something to hope for. Even something as basic as salt could be a luxury. It preserved meat, made broths bearable, and flavored root vegetables boiled into oblivion. But it wasn't always easy to find. It was taxed, fought over, mined in dangerous caverns, and evaporated by the sea in long, grueling processes. A family might buy a small sack of it once a season and guard it like coin. It flavored not just the stew, but the air sweaty and briny in cellars and curing sheds. Salt meant the difference between food that could last and food that spoiled overnight. And what of the sweetness, that rarest of flavors in a bitter world? Sugar, when it appeared, was grainy, brown, and precious beyond words. More common was honey gathered by a hand from hives tucked into trees or kept by monasteries. A spoonful stirred into barley porridge turned dinner into dessert. Fruits were preserved not in syrup, but in vinegar: pickled plums, stewed pears, dried figs, if you could afford imports. A child might go months without tasting anything truly sweet, and then bite into a stolen apple and feel, just for a moment, like royalty. And when sweetness did arrive, it was usually for the dead. Funerary feasts sometimes included spiced wine, sweetmeats, and candied nuts, served not for pleasure, but to mark passing. Imagine sitting at a long, candlelit table, the room thick with silence and the scent of cloves. You sip from a clay cup, the wine too strong, too sharp, the sugar barely softening the taste. A plate is passed: walnuts soaked in honey, figs pressed into cakes, You chew them slowly, aware of every swallow, not because they're delicious, but because they are rare. And rare things in hard lives are sacred. So let your breath slow again, full of soft sweetness and the sour tang of vinegar-soaked roots. Let your mind rest in the dark corners of old cupboards and the backs of stone ovens, the kind of places where food was hidden, preserved, rationed, the kind of places that whisper when everything else is asleep. You've tasted the truth now. You've swallowed the silence, and sleep is very, very close. You are nearly there now, at the edge of waking, at the doorway of dreams. Your breath is like the slow rising of a morning loaf, warm, steady, and sure. You've traveled through famine and feast, through soot-covered kitchens and fire-lit halls, and still you remain. You, listener, are one with the story now. Let your eyes grow heavier as we slip into the final flavors of this journey. Let us take a final moment to visit the monasteries, the quiet beating hearts of medieval knowledge and preservation. Within their stone walls, monks and nuns created a rhythm of life guided by prayer and by modest, methodical meals. They followed rules about fasting, abstaining from meat for days, sometimes weeks, relying instead on fish, vegetables, and pulses. In some abbeys, meat was forbidden altogether, so protein came from lentils, cheese, or almonds when available. Their food was bland but precise, porridge with herbs, bread soaked in wine, leeks boiled with garlic. And yet, even this simple diet was recorded, refined, passed down. In a world where recipes were rarely written, monasteries quietly guarded food traditions, not because the meals were delicious, but because they were holy. And what of the medieval cookbook? There were a few, not for commoners, of course, but for royal kitchens. They read more like poetry than instructions. Take capons and boil them thrice. Blend with almond, milk, and saffron, and set with rice in a fair dish. They assumed a working kitchen and a team of servants. They didn't list measurements. They didn't warn of burning or undercooking. These books were for show like the feasts themselves, elaborate, fragile, not meant for the real world of hunger and hardship. Meanwhile, in the countryside, meals were passed down by memory, from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor. The right way to grind oats, the best time to pick wild garlic, how long to smoke a rabbit so it wouldn't spoil before Sunday. This oral tradition carried survival across centuries, without spices, without stoves, without ovens for most, just hot stones, ash, and hope. And with all that effort, there was still rot. Food went bad quickly. Summer brought flies. Winter brought mold. Cheese grew sour. Meat turned green. Grains sprouted or spoiled. And yet it was still eaten, scraped, trimmed, cooked until the scent was masked. There was no choice. The alternative was hunger. And so families prayed that their stomachs were strong enough, that the bread would hold, that the stew wouldn't sicken them. There were no sell-by dates, only smell, sight, intuition, and faith. And that's what it comes down to, really. Faith that something so bland, so bitter, so gray could still sustain. That soup could heal. That bread could bind. That salted fish could become a meal, not just a punishment. The food was bad, truly, but it kept people alive long enough to laugh, to sing, to love, to pass on their stories, just like you're hearing. Now you, curled up and nearly asleep, have walked through every season of their table. You've stirred pots and salted hams. You've eaten bitter roots and swallowed bone broth. And somehow you too have been filled, not in the belly, but in the heart and the soul, in the quiet corners of your mind where stories simmer. Let the last images rise, now like steam. The flatbread warming on the stone, the child scraping the last spoonful from a cracked bowl. The woman blowing gently on soup so her family won't burn their mouths, the man chewing in silence, grateful for a single salted plum. Let them fade as your breath deepens. Let them vanish as the fire dies. Let the worst food in history nourish you one last time. Now we arrive at the very end of the table. The bowls have been licked clean. The fire has faded into embers. The kitchen is dark but content. You're still here, your body so quiet, your thoughts so slow, your breath like the softest smoke rising from the last stew pot. You've traveled through time, not with your feet, but with your imagination, through boiling broths and muddy gardens, through crumbs and bones, through bitter greens and moldy cheese. And now there is nothing left to eat, only peace. Let's pause one final time and step into the world of rituals, because medieval meals were never just about food. They were about rhythm, about meaning. Grace was whispered before even the most meager meal. Bread was often marked with a cross before being broken. Some families tapped their spoons 3 times on the table before starting, a quiet symbol of thankfulness. Even poor households kept little traditions, feeding the first crust to the dog, burning a piece of meat to honor the dead, leaving a bit of ale for the spirits on certain feast days. These gestures, simple, strange, sometimes sacred, were not about flavor. They were about surviving with dignity, finding meaning in a meal that was otherwise tasteless, honoring the fact that, despite everything, there was something to eat at all. And that's the thread that winds through everything you've heard. Not deliciousness, not indulgence, but endurance, a stubborn, quiet kind of hope baked into every loaf, stirred into every pot, salted into every scrap of meat. It was food that did not ask to be loved. It only asked to keep you going, and that was enough. You felt it now, that slow realization. That medieval food was not about enjoyment. It was about continuing. And here you are, continuing too, through stillness, through story, through sleep. So now, let go. Let the noise of the day fall away. Let the taste of barley and ash drift from your tongue. Let the scent of smoke and soup and sour ale disappear into the night. You are safe, are still. You are full of stories, and nothing more is needed. Let your mind go soft, like dough resting under a linen cloth. Let your heart quiet, like a spoon laid gently in an empty bowl. There are no more kitchens to walk through, no more fields to plow, no more bread to beg, for only dreams, and they are warm. And they are quiet, and they are waiting for you. Good night.